Here to talk about what we just heard from former acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, Matthew Miller, former chief spokesman at the Department of Justice, Frank Figliuzzi, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, just sort of relevant there, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, and Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. Attorney who worked on the staffs of both Robert Mueller and James Comey at the FBI, all MSNBC contributors, all my mentors and advisors in this pursuit. Your thoughts?
We had some new news today, and it's somewhat nuanced, but it's really important. And that is, between your conversation with Andy and ours in the green room with Andy, we've learned something. We've learned.
I love it when that happens.
Yeah, he didn't open a separate case on the president. He added the president to the already predicated, already long existing case on Russia meddling with the campaign. Why is that important? That case was a full counterintelligence investigation. What does that mean? You have specific and articulable facts that someone is or may be an agent of a foreign power. He felt he had enough to add Trump's name to that existing case. That's big news.
Explain what that let him do, adding Trump to a full investigation.
Well, if you want to talk theoretically in concept, you have your full panoply of investigative techniques available to you at the point you add someone to a full investigation. That could even have included going to FISA court and asking to wiretap the president. We know he didn't do that.
Well, suddenly Rod Rosenstein doesn't sound nutso for offering to wear a wire.
Indeed not. The other thing that Matt and I were talking about in the green room, and Matt can elaborate, is this is a masterful chess move by McCabe, because he's playing chess at the highest level. When you add Trump to that case, and if someone were to try to close it, and maybe even that someone is Rod Rosenstein, he'd have to say, I'm closing a case involving the president, and you've added obstruction to this existing case, because we've confirmed with Andy in the green room that the obstruction case was not separate either. He added that to the existing CI case. So anyone trying to close that is closing an obstruction case on the president.
All right, you're down like an FBI rabbit hole. Pull back out for me and explain the significance in terms of what was handed over to Mueller. Two big open cases, one a counterintelligence case, one an obstruction case?
Negative. One big fat counterintelligence case.
So there were never two.
Exactly. That includes an element now of obstruction on the president, includes all known facts involving Russia meddling with the campaign, and has the name Donald J. Trump added to the subject line. Here's knock yourself out, Director Mueller. And Matt can explain why that almost had to happen, almost had to be a special counsel case at the point you added the president to it.
This has been a week of all these revelations changing everything we thought we knew about the Russia question, the Russia investigation, and the Mueller probe. This only adds to that sense.
Yeah, that's right. I'd listen to him and think about the weight he must have been carrying during that 8 days after Jim Comey was fired, when he is left kind of standing in the breach, when the president has assaulted the Justice Department and the FBI by firing its director, when the director is investigating his campaign, when the Attorney General has signed off on it, and the Deputy Attorney General, who now is nominally in charge of the case, has also signed off on it. And I'm sure signed off on it from what he thought. He didn't say that here, but I don't think he believes that Rod believed in the president's reasons for doing that, especially when Rod had seen this letter where he mentions that Andy McCabe's wife was one of the reasons he wanted Comey fired. So I think of the decision. He adds him to this full investigation. He did it in some consultation with Rod. It's not clear how much consultation. It's clear from some other interviews that whether he did consult with Rod somewhat, but he made that decision on his own. And I think they must have decided that technically they got across the legal threshold, but the real reason they did it was the first thing he said to you, which is we had to figure out how we could make this case unkillable. What could we do that would make this case bulletproof? That either Rod Rosenstein, because we don't trust him, or the next Attorney General, if Jeff Sessions gets fired, or the next FBI director, can't kill this thing without explaining why they killed an investigation into the president himself. And I think once he did that, once he took that step, it left Rod Rosenstein with no choice but to appoint a special counsel, because now you have the FBI kind of, in Rod's view, probably running amok. And so for all the weight he was carrying at that moment when the Department of Justice was under assault and people were worried that it may never operate the way it was supposed to again, Andy McCabe stood in the breach and said, I'm going to be the person that stands up and makes sure not just this investigation is protected, but an independent Justice Department and an independent FBI are protected.
Chuck Rosenberg.
Yeah, what you saw today, and by the way, I thought that was just a stunningly good interview, Nicole. What you saw today was somebody who is thoughtful, who's careful, who's deliberate. I don't get the sense at all that Andy relished in this, that he got any joy from this. As Matt said, he was standing in the breach. He had extraordinarily difficult things to do during a period in time when the FBI was in some degree of turmoil, at least at headquarters, at least on the 7th floor. And the things we learned, as Frank pointed out, that they opened a full field investigation and added it to an existing case, to me are fascinating. I'm not surprised that it had two components. We've always talked about it having two components, but we hear it directly from Andy. The other thing I found really interesting, Nicole, this notion, as we have surmised, that these spin-off cases were done with a good reason attached, that the cases would last well beyond Mueller's work and the work of his team, that these spin-offs, as Andy called them, have their own grounding and their own standing, and that capable federal prosecutors and FBI agents around the country have a lot of work to do, even if that report drops soon, as we are expecting it to.
Joyce, your thoughts on the interview and all the new revelations that this was the investigation into the president had all of the powers and the full weight of a full investigation, that really to hear him, who he was at the highest levels of the FBI during the 2016 election. This was a counterintelligence investigation kept secret for the course of the election, but we come to find out all of the president's conduct, all the things we talk about day after day on this show and scratch our heads, confounded them as well.
There's no doubt that they faced an unprecedented situation, and like you, I find former Acting Director McCabe's book to be incredibly compelling and incredibly straightforward, and I think when history looks back on this, he'll be one of the heroes of this era. I would go back to something that Matt said that I think is very interesting. And remember, in the days following Jim Comey's firing, it wasn't at all clear that we would end up with a special counsel. There was perhaps some indication the president did not want to see that sort of a process come into place. And I would tend to agree with Matt that it was this masterful move of combining, of rolling the president into existing matters, of having a full investigation going forward, that put Rod Rosenstein in a position where, whether he was inclined to do it or not, the only option, because of conflict issues, because of DOJ internal policy, would have been to go with a special counsel at that point in time. Of course, we're fortunate that Rosenstein landed on somebody like Bob Mueller. It was his decision to select him as the counsel. But along the way, at various steps, what we see here is that the institution held. The institution was stretched. There were problems, there were challenges, but the people and the institution held.
Your name was invoked.
Yeah, I think she's right about the institution holding. That decision by him, that's a big thing for the FBI to do on its own. Rod, it was clear, was consulted, but he made clear it was his decision. The FBI opens investigations into people, regular citizens, all the time on their own volition. You would not expect the FBI to do that on its own into the President of the United States. Usually that would be a decision made in consultation with the Justice Department, probably made by the acting Attorney General in this case, which is Rod Rosenstein. I think the confluence of circumstances that week where you had three things that happened that really got us Bob Mueller, which is what the Justice Department absolutely needed at a moment of real crisis. One, Andy McCabe's work on the inside, pushing Rod for a special counsel when Rod, according to Andy's book, initially resisted it, didn't want to do it, pushing and then opening this step. Two, Jim Comey working on the outside to leak his memos to make clear how the president had tried to obstruct justice and had tried to ask for a loyalty pledge, had pushed for Lynn's firing.
Let me see if I
before he was fired.
We did the timeline at the beginning. If we could put that back up again. In this 9-day period, Jim Comey's fired. I think it's 2 days later when we learn in the New York Times that Jim Comey had been asked to make a loyalty pledge. So Comey fired on May 9th. Then 2 days later, the president admits to Lester Holt that Russia was a factor in Comey's firing. And I think it's same day, we learn that Trump demanded Comey's loyalty. That was an extraordinary development, sort of in the middle of this. Then the president tweets this about tapes. I remember weeks, months later, Comey saying, Lordy, I hope there are tapes. Good comeback in an otherwise heavy period. And then a few more days later, we learned that Trump, in that meeting where only Russian media had access to it, that Trump had revealed highly classified information, intel from American allies to the Russian foreign minister and ambassador Kislyak and Lavrov. And then you're right, the Comey memos. We start learning about the contemporaneous memos that Jim Comey had kept, saying that Trump had asked him to see to it to let Flynn go, and then boom, enter Robert Mueller.
Yeah, so during those 8 days, you're learning more and more about the president's behavior leading up to Comey's firing. You're learning more and more about why he fired him, and you're learning more and more about his conversation with Flynn. And the conversation with the Russian ambassador, where and the Russian foreign minister, where the president seems like he's actually acting like a foreign agent in the Oval Office. And so you had these confluence of factors, and I think it was the McCabe designation of the president as a subject in this investigation that probably is the thing that tips Rod over to say, I don't have any choice. I'm seeing my reputation destroyed. I now have seen these Comey memos and found out the full history that I didn't know when I wrote this memo. I probably should have known it before he wrote this memo. And I'm seeing the FBI making these decisions to bring the president into an investigation. I am very concerned. I need to do something to get this investigation under control. The only thing he could do to restore the Justice Department's integrity.
Chuck, how will McCabe seems like, knowing what we know from his book and his interview today, in some ways more instrumental to how this will turn out than even Jim Comey?
Yeah, it's not clear to me whether Andy caused the special counsel to be appointed or expedited the appointment of a special counsel. But in some ways, I don't think it matters all that much. What Andy did in those difficult days following Jim Comey's firing is exactly what we would expect a senior leader of the FBI to do, Nicole. I think he is instrumental one way or the other in what had happened, and I'm proud that he's my friend.
We're going to sneak in our last break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.